So when Congress first began to regulate immigration in the late 19th century, deportation wasn't really a regulatory tool on the books. The system built initially was a system designed to screen immigrants by excluding them at the border. And the earliest immigration laws didn't even have deportation provisions. But over time, Congress added provisions that permitted executive branch officials not just to exclude people at the border, but to deport them from the country after they had been admitted and taken up residence. Now, initially, those deportation rules were very narrow, and almost all of them came with lots of limits, like statutes of limitations that ensured that once a person became a long-term resident, they were insulated from the deportation power of the federal government.
What type of statute of limitations were we talking about? If you were here safely for 3 or 4 years, then maybe you could be considered safe?
That's right. The earliest deportation provisions actually said 1 year. So they allowed for deportation in certain situations, but only up to 1 year after a person's admission to the country. But amid rising anti-immigrant sentiment during the World War I period, those statutes of limitations were relaxed, first to 3 years, then to 5 years. And by the time you get to the Great Depression, almost all of them have been wiped out. And today, what that means is that non-citizens, even green card holders, living their lives for a long time in the United States, are still subject to the deportation rules of the federal government.
You mentioned that they were dropped around the Great Depression. Why was that? Was that to protect American jobs, ostensibly?
Ostensibly, as almost always is the case with changes in immigration policy, you have in American politics both the concern about protecting domestic workers and also the perceived threats to the American way of life, right? So those perceived threats are often racialized threats. And in the wake of World War I, that led to some pretty dramatic changes in immigration law. The ones that get taught in American civics textbooks are the changes that led to the rise of the national origin quota system, right? Expressly national origins-based rules that restricted where immigrants could come to the country from.
And these rules largely favored immigration from white European countries and restricted immigration, particularly from China and India and Asian countries.
Yeah, so they favored immigration from Northern and Western Europe. They severely restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern parts of Europe. And at the same time, Congress passed rules or reaffirmed rules that completely prohibited immigration from basically all of Asia.
Was this I'm sorry if I'm getting it wrong, the Chinese Exclusionary Act?
Yes, the Chinese Exclusion Acts were actually the very first iteration of these laws, passed much earlier, almost a generation or two earlier in 1882. So they'd been on the books for a while. They'd been joined by other forms of racial exclusion. Almost all of those racial exclusionary laws were targeting immigrants from Asia. But in the wake of World War I, it wasn't just Asian immigrants suddenly that American politics and political activists were pushing for the exclusion of. It was lots of immigrants from parts of Europe from which there were rising rates of immigration.